This video is going to be looking at the sources that detail the antics of Sejanus. So you can see there's four main authors, Velleius, Tacitus, Suetonius, and a lot of Cassius Dio. So you need to find the Sejanus section in your source book. So the first source we're going to look at is Velleius. One thing you should be aware about with this particular section of Velleius is that it was written before Sejanus had fallen from power. So it's going to be very positive about Sejanus compared to the other sources which will detail his later behaviour. So the first part of Velleius here, which I haven't highlighted, is sort of showing that what happens with Sejanus in terms of Tiberius's initial policy towards him is sort of set in history. Like, this was quite a common thing that had happened. So he sort of talks about people like Augustus had brought in Marcus Agrippa, he'd promoted people, and the reasoning for this is in matters of high policy require administrators of outstanding ability, and practical necessity requires that those who serves the national interest should be reinforced by high status. So it's sort of saying, you know, people before Tiberius had promoted people, they'd done it because they were good and because they were good administrators. So what he's doing is nothing particularly sort of different. So in that respect, Tiberius brought in such an outstanding administrator and in Sejanus Aelius, I think, to assist him in all the burdens of the Principate. So we have the idea that to sort of help administer the city, that people were promoted to do the job correctly, which is helpful for that kind of theme. But also we've got maybe a little bit of evidence about Tiberius being reluctant to rule because he was assisting him in all burdens of the Principate. So he was kind of taking up, well, maybe not taking over, but sort of essentially helping Tiberius in his position. And you can see where he retains that position to this day, shows that this was done before Sejanus fell from power. He also suggests that Sejanus had sought no personal advantage from this position. Other sources will argue that quite differently. And again, it sort of points out that really good people have been promoted and done really well, which is what all this is going through in terms of the late Republic. And it also says it was natural impulse to follow their example, which led Caesar to put the qualities of Sejanus to the test, encouraged him to share in the burdens of imperial office. So this is justification for Sejanus' position while Velleius is writing. The rest of the sources talk about sort of what happened around Sejanus' career and why he then fell from power. So it kind of starts with some Tacitus, and he sort of puts it into some kind of context. So he says he counted the death of Germanicus among his blessings. There's quite a nice quote there about the dynasty and use of family and friends, and sort of shows this that Tiberius and Germanicus had this kind of rivalry, and he became either a tyrant himself or the source of power for the tyrannus, and the cause were to be found in Sejanus. So this is going to give us a little bit of context, and we know that Sejanus was the prefect of the Praetorian Guards. So that was his position before Tiberius started to promote him for whatever reason he decides. According to Velleius, it's because he was really good at his job. Okay. Again, it gives you then a little bit of background to Sejanus about his kind of where he was born, the fact that he was come from quite a wealthy family. It talks about his kind of character. So it says skilled to conceal himself and incriminate his neighbour, at heart possessed by a towering ambition. I should point out this is no different from any other senator, really. Sejanus. Senators are always ambitious, but obviously the sources treat him as quite a big villain and don't like him very much, which will become clear as we're coming through. So starts talking about his career under Tiberius. So we've got some administration evidence. So he increased by massing the cohorts, dispersing them through the capital. So this is the Praetorian Guard. And the reasons he gives is that scattered troops become unruly, and when a sudden emergency called, help was more effective if the helpers were sort of together, which is a good argument for the protection of the city. So he sort of rearranges everything, and he began little by little to insinuate himself into the affections of the private soldiers. So he wins over the Praetorian Guard, treats them really nicely, and also to keep sort of supporters within the Senate. Nor did he fail to hold before the Senate the temptation of those offices and governorships. So he starts kind of promising members of the Senate sort of different jobs. He's keeping soldiers happy, and this is kind of allowing him to gain like a power base within the Senate and within the army as well. I'm just reading this section again, sorry. So, let me read what was it. So he starts to talk about kind of his ambition. So he resolved, however, to make a more secret way and begin with Drusus to like remove kind of key members of the imperial family in order to sort of bring himself to power, according to Tacitus anyway. So Drusus has his wife called Livia. Let me just read that again. Yeah, so he sort of seduces Livia. This is obviously not Tiberius's mother, Livia. That'd be really weird. So he seduces the prince's wife, Livia, and he starts to kind of promise her a marriage, that they'd become like co-emperors, and that her husband would be killed. And she's a very important member of the family. She's grandniece of Augustus, daughter-in-law of Tiberius. So she's got really important imperial links, hence why perhaps he's kind of latched himself onto her to try and move himself up through the imperial family. So then we kind of skip quite a lot through Tacitus. It's a bit of a disjointed story. What we do have is he's being really careful about how he's going about trying to get power. So he'd never asked for the baubles of office, so he's not asking for extra sort of titles and honours. And he's doing that in order to keep Tiberius from sort of suspecting what he's up to. And then eventually he sort of talks to Tiberius, and he sort of says if a husband should be required for Livia, he begged that Tiberius should bear in mind a friend who would derive nothing from the connection but its glory. So he basically wants to marry Livia to get into the imperial family, but he's saying that's not for the reason why he's doing it. He just, it's happened before. Augustus had allowed this to happen. Shouldn't this not happen to him as well? So Tiberius takes a little bit of time to think about this, and then he gives a reply. So initially he praises Sejanus's devotion, and then he sort of says, you're right, this in the past had happened, and that, Livia herself should decide who she should marry after Drusus, or just stay a widow, because obviously she has an important mother who've been natural advisors, and he has to sort of think about sort of the problems within the family before he starts making a decision. But then he sort of says, you delude yourself if you imagine you could keep your present rank, or that Livia, who has been wedded successfully to Gaius Caesar and to Drusus, will be complacent enough to grow old at the side of a Roman knight. So he's sort of saying, it's all very well you suggesting that you don't want sort of any promotion, or you just want the glory of being marrying into this family. But in reality, is Livia going to want that position? Is she just going to want a knight? And he kind of goes through that kind of argument in a little bit more detail here, saying, yes, I know Augustus had done similar things. I've got to put this all into the wider context. And he says, no, I shall pose neither your decisions that or Livia. And he's sort of saying, hang on, let me just read the whole way through. Sorry, just reading it all the way through again. And but he hasn't kind of made a decision outright. He's not denying the marriage at this particular point, but he's sort of not suggesting that he's supporting the marriage at this particular point. So it's a really disjointed story about what's kind of going on. And as a result of this kind of not sort of coming down on one side or the other, Sejanus becomes a bit alarmed about it, and he urges him to discard the voice of suspicion, the babble of the multitude, and attacks of his maligners. So people he suggests that Tiberius is being swayed one way or the other because of these people sort of criticising Sejanus. And at the same time, he starts thinking, right, I'm being Tiberius isn't really supporting me as much as I would like. So he turns to the idea of inducing Tiberius to spend his days in some pleasant retreat at a distance from Rome. So this is kind of when Tiberius decides to go into his kind of inverted commas, retirement. And he does this, according to Tacitus, because then interviews would lie in his own bestowal, letters he would largely supervise. So he would control all the news and information going to Tiberius, and essentially would ready the transfer of the functions of sovereignty. So he'd be sort of like emperor in all but name on behalf of Tiberius, and he would obviously get all the power. So he starts putting this into Tiberius's mind, denouncing the city, jostling crowds, suitors, all the rest of it, and kind of convinces Tiberius to go off and sort of retire from the city. So that sort of is Tacitus' version of what has happened at this particular point. And then we start to see in the next sources, which is Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Tiberius starting to become concerned about the level of Sejanus' power in the city. So, becoming aware that Sejanus' birthday is being publicly celebrated and golden statues have been raised to him everywhere, he starts thinking, oh, hang on a second, is he going to usurp the throne? Tiberius found some difficulty in getting rid of him, mainly because Sejanus at this point is quite popular. So he starts to have varying different plots to sort of keep Sejanus happy on one side and start to move against him in the background. So Tiberius appoints him his colleague in a fifth consulship, and he also said that he sort of made Sejanus believe he would soon marry into the imperial family and be awarded tribunus and power, sort of taking him off guard. And then at the same time, he sends an abject message into the Senate begging, among other things, to be fetched into presence under military escort by one of the two consuls. And he's sort of starting to bring the Senate back on side, because obviously, why would he ask for a military escort unless he's sort of suggesting that he's in some sort of danger, while keeping Sejanus kind of unaware of what's going on and keeping him quite happy. And then, according to Suetonius, you don't really get much information, and suddenly the conspiracy has been suffocated, and you're like, what has happened? Fortunately, well, maybe not fortunately, we have a very long section of Cassius Dio that tells us what happened and what Tiberius's plan in detail was. So this is probably the most useful of the sources that we have a look at. So we've got Sejanus is growing more powerful and more formidable all the time. Senators and all other sections of Roman society treat him as if he was actually emperor. So he's gaining in power. Tiberius is losing power. And they have contempt for Tiberius. So Tiberius is not particularly popular. So Tiberius learns this, and he was afraid that they might declare Sejanus emperor outright to get rid of Tiberius. So as a result, he can't do anything openly because he's obviously worried about his position. Sejanus had completely won over the entire Praetorian Guard, because he'd been giving out stuff, and gained the favour of the senators by benefaction. So they're giving out sort of help, promoting them, etc. Sometimes by promises he made, and sometimes by a little bit of intimidation. He'd also won over all of Tiberius's close associates, so they were immediately reporting to him everything the emperor said or did. So he is in a really quite a weak position here, and Tiberius is obviously somewhat concerned, while no one's telling Tiberius about what Sejanus is up to. So Tiberius is quite isolated. He's realised the problem. This is going to be evidence to show that maybe Tiberius is not reluctant to rule after all. He's been reluctant up to this point because he's gone obviously into sort of retirement, in inverted commas, and now his position is possibly being attacked. He's going to do something about it. So he appoints Sejanus consul, named him sharer of my cares, called him my Sejanus, which sounds lovely, and he starts addressing the Senate and the people with that sort of behaviour. So people are taken in by this, thinking it's genuine, so they set up pairs of bronze statues to both of them everywhere. It's voted that should hold the consulship together every 5 years, and that everybody should kind of like go and meet them every time they're together. So Sejanus is kind of keeping everybody, Tiberius is keeping everybody kind of happy at this particular point. And then we have another section of Cassius Dio, same book, but slightly later. So Sejanus now so great a person in terms of excessive extent of his pride and scale of his power. So it shows kind of the level of threat he would have been to Tiberius. It was he who appeared to be the emperor, and Tiberius a kind of offshore monarch because he's spending his time on the island of Capri. And as a result, there's plenty of anxious jostling around Sejanus' door. So because Sejanus is kind of the face of the emperorship, as it were, because obviously Tiberius is out on holiday, everyone's going to Sejanus, making sure that he's happy, because if he's happy, he will promote them as well. And that's essentially what this is all talking about. I haven't particularly highlighted it, because I don't think it's that helpful in the long run. It's Cassius Dio going on a bit of a rant. What we do have is that loads of people are kind of meeting him, and he seems to be really, really popular. Then he has some sort of omens where things go really wrong. I don't remember what this is. There's like a statue and some snakes come out of the statue or something, I don't know. And he sort of doesn't take the omens to heart, because they never do. They should always take omens to heart, because everything always goes wrong afterwards. And Senate continues to address him as Tiberius' colleague in power, but they're not referring to the consulship specifically, but to the fact that Sejanus has this kind of level of supreme power. But at this point, Tiberius has now got some spies in, and there's nothing he doesn't know, and he's planning how he can put him to death. And he can't find a way of doing it openly, because he's worried that it will be a massive backlash, and that he will be killed, as in Tiberius will be killed or removed. So he starts kind of thinking, right, starts playing everybody off against each other a little bit. So he sends various kinds of dispatches of news of himself to Sejanus and to the Senate. And within these dispatches, he sort of starts being contradictory. So he starts saying he's in bad health, but then also he's really, really well and coming back to Rome. He's lavishing praise on Sejanus, and then he'll also denounce him. And so basically, as a result, Sejanus is kind of filled with extreme elation, extreme fears, and constant suspense. He doesn't really understand what's going on. It's these mixed messages coming from Tiberius in terms of Tiberius's health, but also in terms of Sejanus's position. So he's like, doesn't really know what to do, and he's kind of put him in this state of uncertainty. And he's understandably upset about all of this, and there's not much he can do about it, and this is where the sort of weird snake thing comes about. So later on then, Tiberius sends a letter to the Senate, and he suddenly refers to Sejanus just as Sejanus, not with his usual titles. And then he starts putting a ban on any offerings to a mere mortal, because people were doing sacrifices to Sejanus. So he bans that, and he refused to allow any measure that proposed honours for himself. So suddenly, he starts to sort of attack Sejanus by sort of not outright attacking him, but reducing his honours, and suddenly Sejanus is like, oh, what's going on? I don't know what's happening. The Senate basically sees the writing on the wall, and they're quite a fickle group. Sejanus obviously have been promoting members of the Senate and being really nice to them and sort of praising them, and they've kind of flocked around him. But now that Tiberius is showing less support for him, they decide to change their mind. So then the Sejanus is held more and more in contempt. People start avoiding meeting him. And he sort of goes, oh God, what's going on? Tiberius is informed that the Senate's beginning to sort of change the behaviour. So now he thinks he's got the people on the Senate side, so he then starts to attack Sejanus more openly. So he circulates a rumour he's going to give Sejanus Tribunicum power, but at the same time he sends another letter by this guy called Marco denouncing Sejanus, and he appoints Marco to be the bodyguard, so head of the Praetorian Guard, without telling Sejanus. So he's undermining Sejanus' position without Sejanus obviously absolutely knowing what's going on. So Marco goes to the Palatine to go to the Senate. I'll highlight that. So he meets Sejanus, who's not gone into the Senate yet, and he can see that Sejanus is really agitated because Tiberius is basically ignoring him. And Marco takes him to one side and encourages him, says, you're getting Tribunicum power, don't worry. You know what Tiberius is like, he's a bit all over the place. You'll be happy, you'll be fine. Sejanus obviously takes this as it is and goes, yes, brilliant, hurries into the Senate chamber, and Marco then sends away the Praetorian Guards who've been guarding Sejanus and the Senate to the camp and shows them that Tiberius had promoted Marco over Sejanus, so they all leave. Whew. And then he enters the temple, delivers the letter to the consuls, and left before any of it was read. So then this letter is read out to the Senate. So it was long, does not contain a wholesale denunciation of Sejanus, but then it starts, because it starts with some other issues, and then it starts with a slight criticism of the conduct, and then something else, and then after that some further points against him. So it starts attacking Sejanus completely. And the two senators who were much closest friends were to be punished, and Sejanus himself must be kept under guard. So the rug is literally pulled from underneath Sejanus' feet. So Tiberius does not give the orders to put to death on the spot, probably because he's worried, I'll hide that as well, that maybe some disturbance would occur afterwards. So instead he brings the consuls to himself. I'm just reading it all the way through. And it kind of gives you the context. Before this letter was read out, the senators were congratulating Sejanus on his imminent grant of Tribunicum power. They've been cheering him. They're obviously hoping that once he's got Tribunicum power, he'll give them honours and titles and all the rest of it. But once the letter has been read, the Senate, as I said, sees the writing on the wall, and those who've been sitting near Sejanus actually stood up and left him. So they all start moving away from him within the Senate. They no one wanted to share the same seat with this particular person because they think, oh, hang on, the emperor doesn't like him anymore. That means we can't like him too. And at this, the praetors and tribune surround him to prevent him from rushing out and causing a riot. So he's basically sort of arrested but not arrested. He can't escape, and he's kind of stuck. Okay. The letter continues to be read out, and then once the letter had been completely read out, everyone in one voice started to denounce and curse Sejanus. Oh, how quickly the Senate turns on a person. So now he's kind of stuck, he's got no friends, he's got no supporters, and Sejanus is like, what on earth am I going to do? So this guy here, who's kind of running the Senate, asked for a synod senator whether Sejanus should be imprisoned, and on giving an affirmative answer, he led him out of the Senate and took him down to prison. So now Sejanus is arrested. So he'd gone in thinking he was really powerful and got lots of support, and now he's been arrested, which is obviously a bit rubbish for Sejanus. Okay. They were now dragging him off to prison as if he was no better than anyone else. So he's been completely demoted. He's no more special than anyone else. This is guy who had been basically running the Senate and the the Principate on behalf of Tiberius, and now he is nothing. The man who then bowed and sacrificed as if to a god, this man they were now leading away to his execution. So the Senate meets, they pass a decree sentencing him to death. So the Senate now doing this is not Tiberius, important point. After they passed judgment in his way, the body was hurled down the steps, and the mob abused it for 3 whole days, and then threw it into the Tiber. And then also his children were put to death. I will point out, and I'll scroll back up again, that the rest of that paragraph again talks about sexual assault. So if you don't want to read that, then obviously don't. But ultimately, his family is punished, and his children are killed, and his wife ends up killing herself. And that is the end of Sejanus. So what we have here is some evidence of the fickle nature of the Senate. So they will follow whoever seems to be the most popular. Sejanus was supported initially by Tiberius. They support Sejanus. It gives them titles and honours and powers, and they sort of sycophant around him. But then the moment the emperor shows that he doesn't want to be doesn't like Sejanus anymore, they just change sides. So the Senate's completely powerless here, other than executing Sejanus. But they would have done that on behalf of Tiberius. They are powerless. They are just followers. They're not a body that does anything in particular. They're completely politically impotent and reliant on kind of key individuals showing all the power for them. And that's the sources on Sejanus. That was relatively painless. Long section of Cassius Dio. Obviously, this kind of builds in with, obviously, his retirement, some other conspiracies and opposition that was going around that time. Sejanus is then killed, and then we have the treason trials that follow along afterwards. So it's quite a complex part of Tiberius's reign, this section.